Hello, I'm Shelley Klein, historian and director of education at the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. Thank you for joining us tonight as we mark National Coming Out Day. With this program, we hope to highlight the experience of the LGBTQ community in the Holocaust, and this is the fourth year that we're offering this program. We've once again partnered with Congregation Kol Ami, and we are grateful for their partnership as well as their support of the LGBTQ community here in the Kansas City area. We are in webinar format, so that means if you have some questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I'll be back on at the end to moderate those questions to our speaker tonight. Just a few words before we get started. The history of the queer community in the Holocaust is something that has taken a bit to be incorporated into the broader history of the Holocaust in this time. So it's always exciting when we're able to speak and hear from scholars that are working on and around this history. As we know, with many victims of Nazi persecution and the Holocaust, we know that their wartime experiences stick with them during their post-war years and inform the rest of their lives. And for the group of victims that we're talking about this evening, that story is even more complicated. For many of these individuals, they experienced persecution in the post-war world, and it took decades for their suffering to be recognized and for restitution to be offered. So certainly there is a great deal more to learn about their experience, and I look forward to doing so tonight with our speaker. Dr. Jennifer Evans is a historian of contemporary Germany. She has a diverse range of research interests. She's published books and articles on same-sex sexuality in post-1945 Germany and activism and memory activism. She's collaborated on books about the Holocaust and Holocaust memory, and she is one of the organizers of the Holocaust Education Foundation's conference Lessons and Legacies. She is currently a professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. So it is my pleasure to welcome her to our program this evening. Dr. Evans, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction. I hope everybody can see me okay. I'm going to share my screen and get this PowerPoint up and started. Yeah, it's such a lovely introduction. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak to folks and that you're sharing some of your evening with me. I'm speaking to you today, as Shelley said, from the occupied and unceded traditional lands of the Algonquin people, also known as Ottawa. It's our capital. This place has been a meeting ground of cultures for millennia, and today it is a place of working through complex and difficult histories of Indigenous displacement, of violence, and of genocide. But it's also a space of resilience, which offers, I think, at the best of times, a bit of a beacon of hope for our collective future. Before I begin, I really wanted to thank Shelley and the organizers of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education for inviting me here to my basement office, but to speak with you, and also for the co-sponsorship of this event. I'm so grateful for the invitation, but it does actually fall on an extremely dark day in German history, the 50th anniversary of what has come to be called the Yom Kippur shooting in the eastern city of Halle, which claimed the lives of two victims outside the synagogue, which was the shooter's target. The victims, a woman on the street and a patron of a doner kebab stand nearby, galvanized German resolve to take a strong stand against hate. They took to the streets this very evening in cities across the country, a few short days after doing so already on October 7th, in a silent vigil against the scourge of anti-Semitism. The Yom Kippur attack proved the necessity to view far-right violence capaciously and what we call intersectionally, for the way that white supremacists often draw on a broad palette filled with anti-Semitism, but also Islamophobia, anti-gay, anti-trans, and misogynistic views. In honor of their different but shared struggles, the citizens of Halle erected a space of quiet reflection and solidarity in that shop where people are encouraged to think about their many differences together in opposition to hate in all of its forms. As we know today, this is becoming harder and harder to imagine, let alone to do. And it helps to draw lessons from the past with that in mind. Um, I'm going to offer some suggestions, some examples from how Germany is trying to wrestle with this period in its history over 70 years ago in Germany and in also the German occupied lands, which has been taken up as part of a global struggle for human rights and for recognition. I'm going to focus on the building of the Berlin Memorial to homosexuals persecuted by the Nazis, that's its official name, the result of a long and arduous battle to recognize so called other victims of the Holocaust. Now, notice I didn't say gay and lesbian victims. As you'll hear tonight, there was a huge debate about precisely this: who was victimized by the regime and whose experiences and lives should be recognized by the state. And because history is never simple, this debate unleashed a whole set of questions about how much Germany and the wider world had learned from this watershed moment of extreme violence in the mid 20th century. My talk will ask you to think about what is lost and what is gained in how this history is represented for a national and international audience, where we still find ourselves in some places more than others, wrestling with the fundamental question of how to do right by the victims of existential violence and fascism. I'm going to do this by asking you to think with me about the differences between memory and history. Memory, which French thinker Pierre Nora characterized as ongoing, as evolving, as contemporary, something that serves the purpose of today, versus history, which is always a reconstruction, but also acts as an anchor upon which we build long term judgment. Does the memorial in Berlin represent the history or the memory of persecution? And how well does it do this? How does it fit into the larger memory of the Holocaust? And finally, what does it tell us about the gaps and the fissures in German and maybe even our own coming to terms with the brutal history of the Nazis and the Third Reich and its implications for how we live our lives today? Well, historical geographers have taught us that we get a sense of place when the official meanings envisioned in the grand designs of planners, architects, and government officials rub up against the everyday tactics of ordinary people in staking their own claims to what certain spaces represent in the public mind. When the space in question is imbued with national importance, like a memorial site, existing social cleavages become immediately apparent. One thinks here maybe of some of the debates in recent years around the Confederate monuments. Would be a good parallel, a good example. The discussions that ensue can often be unpleasant and acrimonious, but they're also of tremendous use in getting us to think about how the past surfaces in how we talk about everyday, present day encounters. The discord generated in 2006 by an initiative to commemorate LGBTQ victims of National Socialism provides an interesting case in point. It illustrates how activists and historians, how politicians and city planners and readers of the international queer media, as you'll soon see, helped forge a space for queer place in contemporary Berlin. The design competition put the question of other victims of the Holocaust under the microscope as gay and lesbian activists debated how best to represent the legacy of Nazi sexual and gender politics. The result was a full-scale crisis of representation, as scholars would say, with unintended but important consequences. On the one hand, efforts to realize a memorial to queer victims in Berlin may have begun as a battle over history, over identity, and social memory, but it ended by creating a more broadened foundation for claims to social justice, both in Germany and abroad. People come to this memorial to see themselves reflected, but it has meaning for an international queer public. But on the other hand, though, as Holocaust commemoration expanded to recognize new persecuted groups, there remain significant blind spots and impediments to a full reckoning with the Nazi past. that forces us all to think about our own assumptions about how far we've come in tackling the legacy of homo and transphobia. The debate around how to think about other victims of the Third Reich and the continued persecution of these groups in Germany after the war and elsewhere really forces us to think about what is lost as well as gained in as memorialization shifts from being about what happened in the past to human rights struggles in the present. So, in a way, what I want you to think about is how important are Nazi crimes in how victims groups lay claim to not just remembrance, but to rights claims in the present, and what work remains to be done. But before we look at the debate around the memorial, let me first map out a bit of the history of queer persecution and its place in the larger realm of Holocaust history. Although by now we're quite familiar with the classification system used by the Nazis, the story of persecution itself is complicated. And I should say it's evolving as we are continually researching this. We are literally turning up new files and new stories at the minute. Among the first victims of persecution in Nazi Germany in the early 1930s were political opponents, primarily communists, social democrats, and trade unionists. Jehovah's Witnesses refused to serve in the German army or take an oath of obedience to Adolf Hitler, and they were also targeted. The Nazis carried out a campaign against male homosexuality and persecuted gay men already in 1933 to 1945, using paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code as their guide. They claimed that sexual relations between men were a destructive vice that would lead to the ruin of the German people. And here's just an excerpt of that legal code. Men accused of homosexuality were incarcerated in jails and prisons. And one thing people don't always understand is that they were actually jailed and let go, jailed and let go, jailed and let go oftentimes. So their case files are really complicated. They're not just picked up and sent away to a particular camp. So their story is unique, and it's different in this way. They're incarcerated in jails and prisons. Many are later remanded to concentration camps following the completion of their sentences, though this, again, is an interesting story as there's many different paths through the German carceral system. Nazi racial ideology targeted Jews most of all, but Roma, Sinti, and Black Germans were also persecuted. The Nazis viewed Poles and Slavs as inferior and slated them for forced labor and sometimes death. There was rampant homophobia in the camps, as well as in wider society. And gay men were often the target of especially cruel treatment at the hands of the SS, but they were also often loathed by other prisoners as well, who saw them as rightful targets of the law. So as deviants, they deserved to be there, while other prisoners were seen, believed themselves, and were unfairly targeted. So this is an important distinction to make. Lesbians and trans people were also experienced violence at the hands of the Nazis, but often there were different mechanisms used than those that targeted gay men. There was no official law against lesbianism. Women were denounced for failing to live up to gender expectations, and they often wore black triangles as asocials in the camps. And as with gay men, lesbians could also be treated harshly by other citizens. Here on this slide, we see the images of Marta Halusa and Margot Liu and their dog, who were dance performers in Hamburg clubs before the war and lovers, who even tried to leave the country as the performance group Pepita and Peter. Margot was Jewish. She had married a Chinese national for safety, but he eventually denounced her as a lesbian and prostitute and tried to divorce her. She and Martha went underground and managed to survive for a time, even distributing anti-Nazi propaganda flyers until they were arrested. Remarkably, they escaped detention and managed to stay underground until the Soviets liberated the city, which often brought with it mass-scale sexual violence. They moved to the UK in 1949 and lived out the rest of their days together, buried in the same grave. Ilse Topske, who Laurie Marhofer writes about, was a gender nonconformist caught trying to help a Jewish possible girlfriend flee to Switzerland. Totska was also denounced by their neighbors for failing to live up to proper gender codes and also for cavorting with Jews. Both instances tell us about the role everyday people, everyday Germans played in denouncing them for their unconventionally gendered lives. Trans women were targeted in other ways still. Some with paragraph 175 because they were taken to be gay men cross-dressing or they were sex workers. Liddy Backcroft was adamant about who she was. A sex worker who also danced in the clubs in Hamburg before being arrested, she wrote 2 biographical pieces about her life in her preferred gender. One of them is called Freedom, the Tragedy of Homosexual Love, and the other, An Experience as a Transvestite, the Adventure of One Night in the Transvestite Bar Adlon, with an exclamation mark. So that must have been one heck of a night. She was arrested at a restaurant, sent to jail, where she offered herself to be castrated, but was deemed an incurable transvestite by the Nazis. She was ultimately sent to Mauthausen, where she was killed in 1943. Other people were charged with paragraph 183 for public indecency. And others, like Fritz Kitzing, whose case I've worked on, was actually charged, bizarrely, with paragraph 361 for solicitation, which is normally used for persons assigned female at birth. You can actually consult Fritz's case file with a helpful translation at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, which also, their case file also speaks to the topsy-turvy way that people experience the National Socialist carceral system. And Kitzing is one of those people who is in and out of facilities for a good bit of his life. They also make their way to London, England at one point, where they are forced to solicit sex as well in order to exist. And they're actually arrested there and sent back to Germany by the British constabulary. So there's another story that maybe needs to be told. Many of these stories, we don't know what happened. If it doesn't say in the case file what happened to them, we can assume that they perished, but we can't always know the afterlives of some of these folks, despite some of the best efforts. And someone like Kitzing is a great case in point. The case file sort of ran cold with their final incarceration, and for the longest time, people speculated that they lived in West Berlin, but we didn't really know for sure. And there's an interesting story here that, with the help of Google, we actually learned about what happened to Kitzing when I received an email from their great granddaughter living in South America, because I had published about Kitzing in my book, and this kind of got their attention. They wrote me and they said that they never knew about Kitzing's cross-dressing or transness. They loved him and they supported him. They used those pronouns. And Kitzing ultimately died just before the wall came down, and lived out the rest of their life in West Berlin. Laurie Marhofer, Bodie Ashton, and Xavier Noon have found dozens of cases in the German police and court files of trans masc and trans femme victims, some like Liddy Backcroft, who were unequivocal in their statements to the Gestapo and in life writing found in their case files of who they understood themselves to be. Challenges in the last few years were about how to mark that in Germany. And here's an excellent case in point of Kita Rogali and their Stolpersteine, their stumbling stone, which reflects their preferred name and not their birth name. And this was another one of these places where memory activists really had to fight in order to have some of these people recognized for how they lived and understood themselves to be. These Stolpersteine, or stumbling stones, are a recent example of how people have sought to commemorate gay, lesbian, and trans victims. But what about on a national scale? After close to a decade of lobbying for national recognition of Nazi crimes and emboldened by the state's commitment to the construction of Peter Eisenman's Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, activists in Germany felt a glimmer of hope with the 1999 National Parliament's announcement that the Federal Republic was morally obligated to commemorate the other victims of National Socialism inappropriate ways. Buoyed by this decision, the largest national gay rights organization, the Association of Lesbian and Gays, the Schwulen und Lesbenverband, or LSVD, submitted a formal petition for a national monument. The conservative Green Party ruling majority in government ensured that their 2003 request would be taken up, adding that such a monument should honor the persecuted and killed, keep the memory of injustice alive, and serve as an ongoing symbol against intolerance, enmity, and the marginalization of gays and lesbians. Within 2 years, the Berlin Senate Administration for Science, Research and Culture, Urban and Architectural Art, which is a huge term in German that I'm going to spare you, but it does sound really cool in German, tendered an open call for design submissions to be vetted first by the LSVD, together with the Initiative for the Commemoration of Homosexual Victims. Of the 127 submissions received from as far away as Tel Aviv, New York, and London, the field was narrowed down to 26 to be adjudicated by an 11-member jury consisting of the Berlin Senator for City Development, a prominent art historian, several curators and museum directors, 2 artists, and Günter Droeck representing the LSVD. By 2006, it looked as though the city, state, and nation was finally on its way to honoring homosexual victims of paragraph 175, the anti-sodomy article of the German Penal Code, exploited by the Nazis to police the sexual behavior of male citizens. And here's the history part about persecution. In the post-war period, or in the Nazi period, there were roughly 100,000 arrests and the incarceration of anywhere between 15 and 50,000 men in jails, prisons, and camps. Approximately 60% likely died from their treatment there. It might surprise you to know that although this statute was reformed in 1968 in East Germany and 1969 in the Federal Republic, it remained on the books, so to speak, in slightly altered form in West Germany, where courts had a history of using Nazi-era case files as evidence in post-war trials. And indeed, some scholars have shown there were more prosecutions in the post-war period than even during the Third Reich. So this raises this whole question of, is 1945 an actual end point for some of these people, especially if their case files are used as evidence in the post-war period? There was no attempt to recognize queer victims in the post-war period. In East Germany, if they were communist or Jewish, they could appeal to be recognized as victims of fascism, but not for being queer. In West Germany, the sentiment of the mayor of the village of Dachau is particularly revealing of the homophobia of the post-1945 period. Hans Zauner told an interviewer in 1960, "You must remember that many criminals and homosexuals were in Dachau. Do you want a memorial for such people?" Germany, in other words, wasn't ready in 1960 to think about queer persecution. But it was finally in the early 2000s, after decades of work by activist scholars on the ground and historians in the US and Canada. And this is another story insofar as earlier scholars like Jeffrey Giles for the University of Florida were told more or less that this topic of queer persecution of gay history, is what he ultimately studied, was almost a career breaker, and that it was something he should leave to later in his career. So this shows you that even in North America, where queer history, gay history, lesbian history had a firmer foundation, there was still a sense of taboo around these topics well into the 1990s. Well, the design submission for the memorial from Danish avant-garde artists Michael Elmgreen and Ingar Dragset was selected ultimately in January 2006, precisely because of the way its innovative design evoked this profound sense of grief and alienation. The strikingly simple design, bearing a deliberate resemblance to the block-like stele of the neighboring Holocaust memorial, included a single-paned glass window behind which there was a continuously running black and white film depicting what one journalist called two kissing boys in ironed shirts. And I suppose they are two kissing boys in iron shirts. Given estimates that a full third of the population still found kussende Jungs, or kissing boys, repulsive, these harmless kisses were anything but. And indeed, this design was lauded as art at its most provocative. Despite a few misgivings about the harsh modernism of the design, which differed quite significantly in style from monuments in Cologne, Frankfurt, and Amsterdam, the committee seemed to have weathered the storm of public opinion. That is, until May of that year, when noted feminist and editor of the equivalent, quasi equivalent to Ms. magazine, Emma magazine, Alice Schwarzer, mounted a full scaled media attack. Her argument was that women were not just rendered invisible in the current design, they were literally written out of a shared history of persecution. In a coordinated article in the leftist newspaper Taz, cabaretist Maren Kreumann reiterated that lesbians continue to represent an invisible minority whose experiences failed then and now to resonate within majority culture. Using legal persecution to frame how we understand victimization, she argued, the whole of women's experience during the Third Reich simply fell away. So, again, defining persecution as the Nazis did, that there were no lesbians persecuted because lesbianism wasn't a crime technically under the law, and that paragraph 175 only criminalized male homosexuality, it fails to appreciate people who experience danger voiced in other ways, like Ilse Totska as an example. In the 2 years that followed the Emma action, three things happened. One, the history and nature of persecution itself was widely debated. Two, the links between collective memory and artistic endeavor were analyzed. How do you represent something like this trauma? And three, a compromise was ultimately reached, or depending on one's position, was ultimately forced, resulting in important representational changes to the memorial itself. The debate turned on a few core issues. Alongside claims of the historic and ongoing occlusion of women from history and history making was the issue of whose task it should be to undertake commemoration generally, whether the LSVD truly spoke for all queer groups, or whether the historic enmity between gays and lesbians was better left to small-scaled actions such as those from a decade before, especially in the former East, many of which witnessed significant participation of women, both separate from and in solidarity with men. Finally, there was the issue of reigning myths within the LGBTQ community regarding the scope and scale of Nazi persecution, like the much critiqued notion of a Holocaust, of a targeted and wide-reaching persecution of gay men, deliberately underreported by a homophobic present-day society. Amidst these rising emotions, the memorial debate quickly traveled out of Germany and into the pages of the gay and lesbian news media. In the UK, in the United States, and in Canada. So as not to see the project derailed completely, and perhaps to ensure their relevance as the premier gay and lesbian organization, the LSVD orchestrated a series of podium discussions to address the issues why, judiciously, this was an issue, and it had to be public facing. It needed to be in public. These two were covered extensively by the local Berlin newspapers, by the national media, and also by the international queer press. In two of the sessions, the artists were even on hand to defend their design. "Why on earth would we want to exclude women?" they exclaimed, appearing exasperated by the campaign. The decision to fill the memorial's window with a film about two kissing youths was, in their words, an attempt to portray a vision of intimacy and tenderness in the face of rampant homophobia. Accusing the Emma editors of failing to perceive the way they evoked the gender of oppression in their design through the image of ebullient masculine desire as a salve against a violent and homophobic normative masculinity, Elmgreen and Dragset went so far as to claim it was Schwarzer and her supporters who failed to recognize the feminist aesthetic motifs in their plan. They're actually being really cheeky when they say all of this. The softness of the boys, their effeminacy, the way soft, boyish, sensual masculinity challenged societal norms. So it's an interesting argument. Maybe we might come back to that in the questions. A month after they publicly defended their position, following a general membership meeting in October 2006, the LSPD posted a resolution on its website calling for much hoped for solidarity between gays and lesbians in order to work collectively towards the realization of the memorial's original purpose, to serve as a visible statement against intolerance, enmity, and isolation. This call for solidarity, though, was premised on a condition that the artist's vision of an infinite loop of two men kissing be kept in the final design, both because this was adjudicated by jury and also because it conformed to the history of persecution more generally, a history, again, that disproportionately affected men. Sensing that such a schism could undermine the entire effort, the LSPD called on the federal authorities, specifically the Minister of Culture and the Berlin Senate, to find better ways to integrate lesbians into the artist's vision. It sounds like a pretty good plan, right? Well, this action actually had the effect of further angering the Emma editorial collective. Under the heading Stop the Homo Monument, Schwarzer and her supporters wrote another missive, this time calling out the patriarchal dominance of the gay men in the movement and the lack of power of lesbians in positions of leadership. Their voices held resonance beyond the feminist magazine. A special issue of the major LGBTQ magazine, Siegessäule or Victory Column in English, named after a Bismarck-era landmark that serves as one of the city's biggest cruising spots, showcased opposing positions with members of the Gay and Lesbian Museum, the initiative Remember the Homosexual NS Victims, and a former board member on the Foundation for Brandenburg State Memorials, represented in the opinion piece alongside a single pro-Emma respondent. Although the question of lesbian marginalization seemed to garner minimal support in the local gay press, the position had managed to secure the support of at least one member of the European Parliament, who sent a letter to the chair of the Federal Cultural Commission demanding action. Having learned of the artist's reticence to reconceptualize the piece, Representative Lucy Gruner underscored that there is enough room in the planned memorial site for both sets of stories. She raised a simple idea, the addition of an information plaque outlining the shared but different timelines of historical and ongoing persecution, reminding her federal colleagues that this issue had awakened European interest, which was a veiled reference to the EU's mandate of ensuring human rights. For this reason, she pleaded with them to ensure the exclusion of lesbian women was not allowed to continue. In other words, how the different ebbs, flows, experiences, and legacies of Nazi persecution were to be remembered in Berlin was to some extent about the historical record, but it had now taken on an international importance as a matter of contemporary diversity and human rights struggles. Feminist activism had succeeded in opening up a space for greater lesbian visibility, and by the end of 2007, several prominent Social Democratic and Green Party politicians joined members of the LSPD and Berlin's queer mayor, Klaus Wowereit, to formally request that the artists reconceptualize the monument's design to speak in some way to lesbian experience. And they conceded. The plan was to change the infinite loop of men kissing every 2 years and replace it first with a second film that focused on people reacting to the sight of two people kissing, and then a third film by Israeli artist Yael Bertana, which featured several sensuous lesbian kisses against a backdrop of archival images of gay, lesbian, and even a little trans history. So not persecution in the monument explicitly, but a hint of it in the imagery. At a cost of roughly 600,000 euros, the memorial was finally unveiled by the Federal Minister of Culture, Bernd Neumann, in a ceremony attended by over 400 people in the spring of 2008. Both the controversy and the unveiling quickly entered the international queer blogosphere through transnational subcultural networks and pathways. Already in 2007, the New York City Gay City News reported on the cavernous divide between gays and lesbians. The lack of coalition building has affected gay and lesbian politics in Germany to the extent that advocacy is still very male-centered. An article in The Advocate in 2006 titled A Memorial of Our Own underscored the importance of Elm Green and Dragset's design to an international queer identity politics. while a later article went a step further in placing the Berlin Memorial in conversation with other transnational queer commemorative cultures, like those which have resulted in memorials in Amsterdam, in Sydney, and in Tel Aviv. Even the small Pennsylvania Erie Gay News reported on the plans to build a memorial in Berlin, calling special attention to the ongoing stigma German victims experienced after the war. The queer media engagement with the memorial demonstrates just how pivotal Nazi persecution of homosexuals was and remained to gays and lesbians abroad. Indeed, almost every article cited its placement in close proximity to the Eisenman Memorial as a site that injustices against gays and lesbians finally had acquired serious treatment in Berlin's memorial landscape. Along the same vein, they referenced that the federal government had sanctioned its construction. What began as a testament to German public memory had transcended the national orbit and was taken up as a symbol of the historic mistreatment of gays and lesbians the world over. Building the memorial was greeted as an important step forward in recognizing past wrongs. But perhaps more importantly, it served as a rallying cry for ongoing human rights struggles, often positioned in these papers next to stories about gay marriage, as an example, or HIV stigma. In this way, the building of the memorial aided in the materialization of queer memories of suffering, linking the German past to a transnational present. In cyberspace and among the readers of the subcultural media, the memorial helped lend shape and form to a universalized set of common queer collective memories. The events in Berlin turned on the history of Nazi crimes. But in linking the memorial symbolically to the ongoing battle against marginalization and homophobia, and a little bit of transphobia, and I should emphasize a little bit, and that's another story, the memories conjured up by the memorial helped bind international queers emotionally across national and temporal divides. In queering place in Berlin, not just in the sense of creating a space for a queer memorial, but in transcending state and nation, the memorial and the international reportage in the queer counterpublic sphere constructed an alternative kind of kinship based around shared legacy, shared heritage, and the symbology of Nazi violence and its importance for today's queer identity. At the same time, these tensions and the fraught politics of commemoration suggest that queer kinship and solidarity, even in the face of common causes, is not always easy. And it wasn't always entirely inclusive either. While we certainly may celebrate efforts to recognize LGBTQ persecution as a breach of human rights, it's worth pondering again what is lost as well as gained in the quest to concretize such a vision of queer consciousness in public memory, especially one that's rooted in identity politics and increasingly disconnected from the past, however heroically represented in the present. Let me focus in on a few concluding points around this theme. What I've drawn for you today sounds like a narrative of success, and it is, to some extent. In the last few minutes, I'd like to come back to this question of the losses and gains to this newfound visibility, and whose stories still don't sit easily in this narrative. Most obviously, maybe, there's still much we can say about who isn't represented in this memorial and in public consciousness. Most notably, transgendered people still tend to slip through the cracks of human rights legislation and commemoration. Visibility for some has come on the backs of the continued invisibility of others. In fact, Alice Schwarzer, so adamant to see women represented in the memorial, has been one of the biggest transphobes of the past years, arguing against vital legal reform measures that would make life more livable for trans people today. She's been joined in recent years by people like Maria Luisa Fulbrecht, a gender-critical graduate student in biology who regularly takes on trans issues in social media. Fulbrecht was taken to court last year for relativizing the Holocaust by arguing that trans people were not actually victims of the Nazis. At the same time that this is demoralizing, along with recent statements by a certain author of children's books, who shall remain nameless, in 2023, the German parliament did officially commemorate gay, lesbian, and transgender victims of the Holocaust. as part of the January 27th Holocaust Remembrance Day, which took place on the 78th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Danny Dayan, chairman of Israel's Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial, said that while Jews were the Nazis' primary target, he welcomed the broadening of Germany's remembrance culture. The Holocaust was an onslaught against humanity. LGBTQ individuals, Roma and Sinti, mentally disabled persons, but especially against the Jewish people, he told the Associated Press on a visit to Berlin that week. The head of Germany's Central Council of Jews, Joseph Schuster, agreed that while the main group of Holocaust victims were Jews, they weren't the only ones. It shows that the developments seen in the Nazi period can lead to any social group being targeted, he told the press. So this is powerful in the context of people trying to discredit the truth around other victims and their place in the history of the Holocaust. But we have to remember too, as Anna Heikova's work has shown, it is one thing to recognize gay, lesbian, and trans victims, and another thing for some folks to think about Jewish survivors who might have had same-sex encounters for survival or as part of their everyday life. So homophobia and taboo is still with us. We could go a step further and say that by hinging the memorialization of other victims on discrete, bounded, and stable identity categories, we are also committing a disservice, because people's lives then and now don't always conform to neat and tidy identity categories. What does it mean that we create a memorial that suggests there is coherence when the historical record presents a far richer and more complicated story? Some of the victims of the Nazis were sex workers, while others served in the Wehrmacht or had sex across the age barrier, but were also victimized by the state. And how do we communicate that level of complexity to a broad public when, as we see in the Twitter sphere, memory wars don't care much for empirical truths? But there's more to the story of identity too. When we think solely in terms of siloed identities, we also fail to see the rich history of intersectional stories, or what I've called kinship, to speak to the sense of solidarity that comes from seeing oneself in the plight of others. It's true that there are people who don't want to hear this story. One of the main opponents of including lesbians and also trans people as victims works for the Fritz Bauer Institute, which is hard to square because it in itself is named after the Jewish German and closeted homosexual jurist who helped bring Adolf Eichmann to trial, and in whose name the Institute studies civil rights in the shadow of the Holocaust. And finally, what are we to make of the fact that memorials like this and initiatives, however inclusive, and indeed we have to celebrate this because it was hard fought and hard won, are nevertheless viewed by governments and sometimes rights organizations to make the argument that we in the West have processed this long and terrible history, while other places, and on the memorial plaque you see this spelled out plainly, while other places in the East supposedly lag behind. And indeed, as the work of Jin Haridawarn and Christopher Ewing have shown, and Sebastian Tremblay, many of the debates around the memory and the kissing youths happened at a time of heightened activity among mainstream gay and lesbian organizations against the supposed homophobia of migrants, going so far as to organize kiss-ins in front of mosques in Berlin and conducting deeply flawed surveys that neglected to consider that homophobia might actually be a homegrown problem and not simply something imported from outside. As though there are no hate crimes committed by right-leaning Germans in Berlin or in Halle, or Brits in London, or Canadians in Montreal or Toronto, in large and small town America, which regrettably is ever more difficult, or is increasingly more prevalent to imagine today. So to sum up, instead of lingering over this battle over definitions of persecution as an example of the corrosiveness of identity politics, I've argued it might be more useful to see it as an exercise in kinship and placemaking. That is, as a process by which memory gels and becomes fixed in actual material space. Efforts to make the memorial speak to everyday oppressions, those both in Germany and abroad, afforded it a more fixed, though no less problematic, meaning as a site of reflection, pilgrimage, and memory. Contemporary Berlin's importance as a site of 21st century rights struggles is forged in large part due to its location at the intersection of multi-layered, multi-perspectival, and often emotionally charged narratives of place. And yet, it is well worth considering what is lost as well as gained in the quest to concretize such a vision of queer consciousness in public memory, especially one that, however heroically committed to the present, still continues to make mistakes from the past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Evans, for that really excellent presentation. It was very, very thoughtful, and I think we have a lot to think about here. If you are listening and you would still like to ask a question, please put that in the Q&A, and we'll get it moderated here. Just a few things that come to mind as we get started. I wonder if you might speak to this issue of language, because that's something that makes this particular aspect of history a bit difficult, because of course when we're looking at the Nazi period, the term they're using is homosexual, and that isn't something that we use much anymore. There's lots more specific identities to use. So I wonder if you could speak about that both in your research and your writing and a little bit in your teaching as well.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I mean, it goes to both how we find people in the historical record. So having to use language and sometimes slurs in order to find these people, and then what happens when you're actually reproducing those documents in a classroom, in a public talk. And there's certain, medicalized terms that come out of sexology that are seen today as, just not kosher, as we can say. And so this raises all sorts of issues. And I mean, the way that we often deal with it in writing and also in our classes is we just really spell that out, that these terms have a history. Um, some of these terms we might choose not to use. Same also for pictures, photos. There are some images that we choose not to show because they're just too, they're too exploitative. They fall outside of the acceptable. One case in point would be some of the well-intentioned sexological photos from the 20s that
Mm.
showed before and after images of trans persons, focusing in on their genitals, and we make a conscious choice that those are images we can describe. We can describe in our writing evocatively enough. We don't have to reproduce these images, which today are seen as problematic, as exploitative, as really non-consensual even. So we historians really do think long and hard about these kinds of things. At the same time, how do you recognize people in the past? And you have to sort of go with the Nazi lexicon, as troubling as that is, because that's how they surface in the archive. Otherwise, we don't see them. If you went to look for trans mask individuals, you're not going to find them, right? Because that's not the terminology
Right.
that at the time. So these are things we spend a lot of time thinking about.
Yeah, well, thank you. And again, I think that something as basic as how we describe it is so important to get right with people. This Berlin Memorial is so interesting in terms of like the debate and how it evolves. I wonder if you could speak to its influence on other memorials. So once it was established in, the capital, did we see lots of others pop up in other cities? And if so, did they have similar debates? Did they look similar?
Yeah, it's actually, I mean, there were pre-existing memorials. Amsterdam had its memorial earlier. There are a lot of smaller scale kind of community level memorials. So like even in the neighborhood of Schöneberg at Nollendorfplatz, there was a pink triangle erected. So there had been a whole bunch of different commemorative strategies before the National Memorial, and the Berlin National Memorial was, I don't want to say late to the party, but it was one of the later ones to be constructed. At the same time, Berlin's memorial landscape is a really funny place. Anybody that's been, you can spend just a day going from memorial to memorial. There, you see in the talk how once we see the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe go in, that creates a language for sort of representing people in the past, and so that is then used strategically by other groups. And the Sinti and Roma are also able, in the aftermath of the gay memorial, as it was originally called, they're able to then say, well, we are also, we also need to recognize our experience of persecution. There's a really nasty little story right now. It's an amazing memorial, also in the Tiergarten Park for Roma and Sinti. But because they're doing urban renewal, they actually are going to try and remove it, relocate it. But it's actually, really troubling because they fought so long to see themselves commemorated. And so this is another one of those examples where memory projects bring up all sorts of emotions and conversation.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, to my recollection, I have thought of the memorials that come to mind of this history are often represented by a pink triangle. And so one thing that I always found interesting about the Berlin one is that it did choose to go in such a different direction, which really did have that possibility of more inclusivity baked in from the very beginning. So it is interesting that that video then caused so much controversy because it was in itself exclusionary. I
Yeah,
wondered
there's
if
a
you,
funny.
oh, go
I was
ahead.
going to
Yes.
say there's a little sidebar story to that. That original image of the Kusende Jungs, of the kissing boys in their white crisp shirts. So there was another controversy a few years back that one of those boys actually was a Danish actor and member of a far right party. And so,
Oh.
this memorial in all sorts of ways created controversies that needed to be unpacked. So even a success such as marking it in the memorial landscape, brought with it all sorts of all other stories that are really tricky, like the fact that there there is some appeal to sort of for far right masculinities and queerness. So that has to be
Hmm.
thought through.
Well, I wondered, yeah, if you could speak a bit more to what you alluded to with this, the memorial makers trying to argue against the fact that they were excluding women by being subversive in their depictions of masculinity.
Yeah, I actually think that's a really interesting argument. I mean, this is one of those examples where the scholarly conversation, versus the sort of conversation in sort of the public sphere, where for scholars, recognizing the diversity of masculinities, a soft masculinity, a youthful masculinity. I mean, I actually think their argument, is not entirely wrong. At the same time, if you're viewing it solely through strict identity lenses, then you're just seeing them as guys. And so, there is some truth to both of these arguments. But I actually found I also found the original film really subversive in the sense that it's erotic. Like if you actually watch the original film, it's long and drawn out sensual kissing. And as we know, as queer and trans folks seek visibility, what is lost often, right, is that sort of other part of everybody's, lives, which is the erotic, which is the frisson of sexuality. So it's like the trade-off to being represented is you have to be represented in a certain way. The second film that was commissioned was this sort of strange, jaunty, ugh, it was like shot in various locations in Berlin, and it was like these folks kissing and those folks kissing and those folks kissing, and it just really lost that edginess that original film actually had. So again, losses and
Mhm.
gains. Yeah.
Is the second film the one that is currently playing?
No, they're the one that
That's the third one. Okay.
the third one. Yeah, the one that
Yeah.
that one is another, reimagining of how to tell this story in a much more broadened way. And they are supposedly shifting, trading them out. But every time I
Mhm.
go to look, I mean, the downside is that every time I go to look, the actual window is usually broken because it's still a site of yeah, it's still a site
Mm.
of homophobic,
Mhm.
pushback. So the
Yeah.
memorial's official use and then how it's used in every day really, says a lot about
Mm.
acceptance.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point that it does get vandalized.
Mhm.
As we talk about when this history is officially recognized and when, especially paragraph 175, victims are able to be, get restitution. What about the asocial group? Are there memorials to specifically asocials? Have they been recognized in terms of restitution at all?
Yeah, no, this is the thing is that, when you think of that one slide, the image we all know of the various triangles representing all the different groups, some of the people who are seen as the least, yeah, the least easy to think about, right? So green triangle victims. So people who committed crimes who were, crimes against the criminal code, but then were also, brought into the camps. There's absolutely really no public pressure to recognize green triangle victims. Black triangle victims are very tricky. Slave labor, until very recently was not really well represented within Erinnerungskultur or memory politics. And so indeed, right, people who were seen in the post-war period as still occupying those very difficult subject positions, there wasn't a community to back, commemorating them or restitution and this kind of thing. And it's, we see it even just so simply in terms of Roma and Sinti commemoration.
Mm.
So yeah, it's really very fraught. At the same time,
Mm.
they can borrow from you know, each other's work.
Yeah. You mentioned this difference between, well, obviously paragraph 175 stays on the books of both East and West Germany for quite a long time, and that there is a difference in how they're like how frequently and to what extent they're prosecuted. Could you speak to that difference and perhaps tell us a bit why they were so different?
Yeah, it's really surprising to think about the fact that in East Germany, it's not to say that it was easier or that it was with less danger to be queer, to be gay specifically, but there does seem to be more latitude and a little bit more, at least legally, a little bit more wiggle room. West Germany really is the chief offender, and I've looked at case files myself that where it's just unimaginable to think that within a court case record that you'd actually see Nazi era jurisprudence, used as evidence. I mean, it's shocking to actually think that that was permissible, but that was the state of play until 1969. In East Germany, it's earlier that they kind of revoke the paragraph, but there's other ways of monitoring, surveilling, and conditioning behavior. And so this is where someone like Sam Huneke's work is really instructive about how the Stasi, would actually use same-sex relations against citizens to get them to tattle on other citizens. How there was the sense in the Cold War during the Lavender Scare that not just in capitalist countries that if you were queer you were maybe a communist, but in the communist East there was also this sort of bizarre self-loathing that gays, lesbians were money grubbing, materialist opportunists. So there was all sorts of interesting ways in which, although not officially in East Germany, people were still monitored with at the same time a little bit more freedom of movement and association. So yeah, it's an interesting. It kind of plays against your assumptions, but at the
Yeah.
same time, it's not like it was a complete nirvana in East Germany either.
But yeah, it's definitely surprising when you think, oh, it's you usually assume the better things are happening in West Germany than in East, at least from a Western perspective. You've touched on a few of these, but I wonder if you could speak to some of the challenges facing this field right now, and even challenges to your own research as you go about it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Germany right now is a very interesting place, and there have I would say there have like I say in the talk, there are tremendous gains. There have been tremendous strides. There are more and more exhibitions representing queer, lesbian, gay, trans lives. There is a commitment to telling these stories. There is a commitment to complicating these stories and saying these sound, and especially in the post-war period, these sound like very white stories. And how do we think about the fact that West Germany, East Germany in its own way too, became migrant societies in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Where are those stories? So there's wonderful work that's happening in looking at, BIPOC, trans of color, queer of color stories. What is still, I think, a challenge is actually getting this kind of work recognized in the universities, because the universities in Germany are still very conservative when it comes to how they teach history. And so there's this kind of divide between community history, activist history, and scholarship. And I'm lucky because my work has been recognized um, as by some of the larger foundations. And so I'm trying to use that as a way of getting more recognition for community activists whose work we all, rely on, because they're the ones that are actually in the trenches doing this work every single day, often with, a shoestring budget. So that's one of those places where we need to see where Germany could do better. And then this last point that I made in the monument of Germans, understandably feeling a sense of pride that they have worked through this horrendous past, and they have, but also some of the blind spots, especially around homophobia as a German thing. And that's one of those things we're seeing right now really play itself out in the current context with the
Mm.
war in the Middle East. The how easy it becomes to see homophobia as something that Muslims possess, and that Germans have worked through all of that, but it's
Mm.
it's folks from away, and that's one of the places where Germans, like everyone, need to be reminded that hate, is grown at home, and
Mhm.
that's another one of those lessons. Mhm.
It's so interesting when we look at memorialization, and we often talk about, it is a marker of where society is based on how they can face their history and establish memorials. And yet there is this danger at times of putting a memorial up and then forgetting, right? You could remember to forget. But it seems like specifically in these memorials that you're talking about, it does have this really impactful effect of bringing it to the current conversation, especially in this debate about the video. Here's this monument about the past, and yet it really involved a current discussion about who's included and who's excluded and whatnot. So I think that really makes this work so very interesting and powerful and continually applicable.
Yeah. And even as awful as the vandalism is, that also keeps this story alive, right?
Yep.
It forces us to recognize that this is not just something that occurred in the past, that this still has resonance today, and that we still have to work in order, to really work through some of these things. So the memorial, much in the same way that people really are nervous about how the memorial across the street, the Memorial to Murdered Jews of Europe, is used, if people are sitting on the stele, if they're eating their lunch on the stele, and that makes people angry, well, good. Then people are asking the question of like, what happened? What
Right.
does this mean? How do we commemorate it? What behavior is appropriate behavior? These are good things in the sense that they surface stuff that hasn't yet been processed well.
Mhm.
So they are, as you say, they're living memorials, and they're
Mhm.
continually being used and thought through. And that's important.
Well, thank you so much for this presentation and the very important work that you do. This was really exciting, and I hope that I hope there's an opportunity to do another program with you in the future. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. Have a great rest of your night.